I'm joined by Maximillian Alvarez, the editor-in-chief over at The Real News, the host of the Working People podcast, and the author of the new book, The Work of Living. Working people talk about their lives in the year the world broke, described by Cornel West as magnificent, a powerful vision, and a subtle analysis. I agree with Dr. West. Maximillian, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey, brother. Thanks so much for having me back on. It's an honor to be here.
So this book is based sort of off the work that you do through your podcast, where you're interviewing working people who often don't have their voices represented enough. At what point did you realize something's going on here? You need to turn this into a book.
It's I'll be honest and say that I was actually a little skeptical at the thought of a book when it was first presented to me, because I've always been more partial to the medium of audio. I think that's where I feel most comfortable. It's where I think you can get the most intimate with the kinds of discussions that I try to have with working people on a weekly basis. And in fact, in the early days of COVID-19, in the late spring, early summer of 2020, everyone remember where we were at that moment. It was awful. It was terrifying. No one knew what was really going on. It was a very dire time for all of us. And I put out a call on social media for my podcast, Working People, to ask people to submit testimonies, workers from around the country and even beyond, send in testimonies describing what they were going through in their daily lives at work and so on and so forth. And I got a truly incredible and overwhelming response. And so I ended up publishing almost 6 hours worth of compiled testimonies in a 2-part episode, which people can go back and listen to on the Working People catalog. And I was just so struck by the stories that folks were sharing. And the thought had crossed my mind on like doing something more with that. And thankfully, Teddy Ostro at Or Books approached me about doing a book in that vein, where I spoke with workers about what they were going through during the first year of COVID-19. And like I said, I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to go that route, but I started to see over the course of just a few months, right, how quickly that amnesia was setting in and how quickly we were learning to accept the very things that were so unacceptable to us, just months or weeks before, right? Whether that was accepting that, well, we can't get PPE for everyone, so some people are just going to have to die, right? I mean, that is unacceptable. And we rightfully push back against companies not providing adequate PPE for frontline workers in those early days. But again, we kind of got used to it. We got used to being told no. We got used to being told it wasn't possible. We just came to accept that companies like Amazon that made these PR moves of granting their workers quote unquote hero pay, because they wouldn't call it hazard pay, because then they would have to continue paying workers that extra amount for as long as the hazard persisted. And COVID-19 still persists, right? So that they knew how to wiggle their ways out of that. But, when these companies made a big song and dance about giving their workers, their frontline workers, their heroes, right, this quote unquote hero pay, and then just weeks later, they ripped it away without any input from workers if they didn't have a union to negotiate over such things. And we just kind of learned to accept that. And not only that, but I saw how we were seeing firsthand, right, all the systemic failures of a hollowed out society where, capitalists and bought off politicians on both sides of the political aisle had contributed to, just completely destroying the social safety net, hollowing out vital public institutions, entrusting so much of the maintenance of our shared society to the quote unquote market. And we saw when COVID-19 hit, how rotted the foundations were of our public institutions that we needed more than ever at that very moment to take care of people. We forget about this stuff, but you'll hear it in the book, people trying to get unemployment, right? And systems crashing left and right, like hospitals being just completely overwhelmed because, they had been understaffed for so long and more work had been piled on fewer workers. All this stuff really came to a head in 2020 when COVID-19 hit. And we saw that both on the government side and especially on the private market side, they did not give a damn about us. They were willing to sacrifice us while, the ruling class kind of like was hid comfortably in their second homes and quarantined the whole time and had gig workers bringing all their food for them. So long story short, I just started to see first how horrific and unforgivable the societal failures were at this moment. But I also noticed how quickly we were allowing ourselves to accept that. And so I wanted to preserve that moment in time through the voices of the people who were living it so that we would never fully forget it, so that we could always remember, in fact, who and what we're fighting for and why we're fighting for it.
Well, you describe it as the year the world broke, which is a pretty apt description. In these interviews with the workers, you can see that the pain and fear that they're dealing with, that we all were dealing with at the pandemic, but particularly those that literally had to sacrifice their life to go to work every day to keep society running. In a lot of ways, the world has not been fixed, obviously, since 2020. And because of this great forgetting that you've talked about, in a lot of ways, it's worse for working people because at the tail end of 2020, at least you had, and it wasn't available to a lot of workers because of these unemployment systems crashing, but you had some public lifelines going to people to where they did have the option to stay home. A lot of people were still illegally evicted, but there were a lot of people who could stay in their homes because of actions taken by some local governments and the federal government in terms of the moratorium on evictions. Here we are in 2020. All those are gone now. And you have a sustained campaign by the ruling class elites in capital through the Federal Reserve to punish workers because they've had slightly extra pay because a lot of them decided they're not going to be put up with this stuff anymore after the pandemic. So, revisiting these interviews from now, where are we in terms of how workers are dealing with this crisis that broke the world and still hasn't fixed it?
Man, it's a great question. I think, you the point that you made is really the most important one, is that the world, the things that have broken have not been repaired.
And arguably they were broken before the pandemic, right? As a lot of these workers you interview talk about in the book.
Very much so, right? And that, is it sure as hell is an American tradition. I feel like it's a tradition in many other places around the world, right? What is it? It's like, it's the opposite of it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. In America, if it's broke, don't fix it, right? Just keep putting pressure on it. Just keep throwing more money at police, even though they don't reduce crime, and just keep imprisoning and shooting people, right? Just keep giving money to billionaires and Wall Street, even though they keep doing the same stuff that crashes the economy and exacerbates inequality. Let's just keep doing the things that are making our society worse and somehow magically believe that they're going to get better for working people. I think that same principle does apply here, but I would underline, right, something that you pointed out, and this is something that my brother Zach Alvarez and I talk a lot about. Zach's an economist. I'm the humanist of the family, and we have talked about the fact that what happened under COVID, and we're talking what happened during the Trump administration and carried over into the Biden administration, was actually quite paradigm shifting, or it could have been, right? Because compare it to the government response to the financial crash, the Great Recession in 2008, where a lot of my own origin story for this book, for the podcast, kind of came from. At that moment, the government did everything that it could to throw itself around the banks and, corporations that were being bailed out, all while letting so many millions of working people and working families like mine fall into the abyss. What was different in how we responded to COVID-19 was the government actually put money directly into people's pockets through a number of different means, right? It actually, and I want to be very clear, I'm not, we could have done a whole lot better. There were so many ways that we screwed this up and made it worse. We could talk for 10 other segments about that. But what we did do was still so radically different from what the US typically does in crisis situations like this. So that was the stimulus checks. It was the child care tax credits. It was the eviction moratorium that you talked about. It was pausing student loan repayments, right? These things really did have a significant impact on the lives of working people. And you'll hear it in the interviews in the book, right? It's kind of, and people express a sort of guilt saying it because they're like, I know how terrible things are. I've had friends and family members who have died. I've had coworkers who have died. I'm still terrified. And yet, because of the situation, because I can actually collect this additional unemployment, I'm able to sit at home, not risk my life at work. I'm able to spend time with my kids. I'm actually able to breathe for the first time in I don't know how long. Like, how crazy is that our economy was driving working people so hard and grinding them so far into the dust before COVID that even just a slightly extended unemployment benefit gave them the ability to pause in a way that they never had before, because they were always working and living so close to the bone to pay rent, to buy groceries, to send their kids to school, so on and so forth. So like even just that modicum of compassion, right, from a very uncompassionate state in the US did such a tremendous amount for working people. But as you said, the ruling class could not let us get away with that. They did everything they possibly could to rip that stuff away as soon as they could. And in fact, legislators around the country used this like business class manufactured, no one wants to work anymore narrative because everyone's just sitting home getting fat off of public money. They used that in state legislatures to justify ripping away vital pandemic aid. And it was proven that in states that did this, people did not go back to work at greater rates. In fact, they probably on average went back to work at a lower rate than they did in other states that were still providing those benefits. So it really was just a cruel act by the business serving class and the business class itself to beat working people back into submission. Not only that, afterwards, having noticed that workers had gained a little bit of financial stability, again, a very little bit, but pausing student loan payments, the stimulus, all that stuff contributed to having enough of a backstop that more people were quitting their jobs people were quitting in record numbers in what we call the Great Resignation, because they finally had the ability to say, I can quit my job and I'll at least have 2 weeks to live off of while I find another job, right? They actually had that little bit of space to do so. Or they said, you know what, I'm going to demand a raise, or I'm going to speak up to my manager and ask for, demand better working conditions, right? I'm going to go on strike, right? There are workers who went on strike during the pandemic and who said, like, we were called essential. We kept this company running. We kept this economy going. We need to be treated as essential, right? We need to actually see that at the bargaining table. We don't want our companies just saying, oh, heroes work here. But when we need like good health care benefits, better pay, better work protections, and so on and so forth, the boss is nowhere to be found. So all of this is just kind of pointing to the fact that working people gained a modicum of ground at a very scary time, and the ruling class could not stand that. And so, what did they do? They jack up prices, right? And now we're calling it inflation while CEOs and shareholders are raking in more money than they ever have. The crazy statistics that There was a higher jump in corporate profits over the past year than there had been in any year since like the 1950s, right? This is class war. This is what it looks like. They are clawing back any gains that working people had made by artificially like creating this sort of crisis or building on the existing crises like COVID and the war in Ukraine to rob us all blind. And I think that you're seeing a real struggle here between workers who are not going to just be kind of stuffed back into the hole and accepting the sort of submissive position that we were in before the pandemic, when the system admitted that workers are essential, right? A lot of working people already knew how essential they were, but COVID forced capitalism, it forced the state to admit that actually working people do hold the world up. They do keep this society running, and we would crumble without them. You don't forget that kind of thing, right? I mean, and so I do think that has contributed to the growing labor militancy, to the growing class consciousness, to even just people feeling a little more emboldened to say, I deserve better than this. I am worth more than this. I don't want to waste my life being treated this way. And so I think that's really exciting. But yeah, we're still in a very, very broken position. And, the ruling class will do everything it can to rip away any moderate gains that we make.
Yeah, capital can't blame a labor shortage on workers and at the same time tout record profits that they've had. Those two can't exist at the same time. Maybe you have a labor shortage because you won't invest some of the record profits you're making into paying workers more to come work for you. You can't have it both ways. But I did enjoy reading your book, Max, and hearing the different perspectives of workers across the spectrum. You're interviewing gig workers, steel workers, educators, nurses, and all of them bring a unique perspective to how they're dealing with the pandemic, the pain they're dealing with. I enjoyed reading the chapter on Dwayne, a member of the Navajo Nation, in which he's talking about what he sees as the origins of COVID is Earth rebelling against the way we are living our lives, and how the lesson is to, return to nature, be more self-reliant in a way that's more in tune with the world. But I was trying to search for some consensus among workers, like what kind of shred of agreement existed among all the workers you interviewed, and I found that, like, we talked about the government help that they talked about receiving, but by and large, most of them seem to understand that the only way things are going to change is it's in their hands, that it's among organizing their own fellow workers. And, there's, I'm going to just read from Rebecca, the teacher organizer. I think she's in Arizona. And, she talks about the ultimate goal of unity is to unite the working class, because there is a class war going on. It is us versus them. We, the 99%, need to understand that we're not at war with each other. So she's talking about, consciousness against job, across the class, no matter what job you're in. What other, did you pick up that consensus, and what other consensus did you find through these interviews with all working people from various industries that were forced to show up during this pandemic?
So I really, really love that you tease that commonality out, because I don't think I'd quite put it in those terms yet, but I think that you're exactly right. So I would complement that with another sort of, synthesized takeaway that like a common thread that I see running through these 10 interviews with 10 very different people, all of whom I'm truly honored to know, and so grateful to for talking to me this much and this openly for this book. I mean, it really, really is theirs as much as it is mine. But I think that's one of the things that I try to really emphasize in the beginning, right? Is that everyone has a unique story. Just by virtue of being ourselves, every single one of us is unique. And there's something really important in that. There's something I try to honor in kind of lifting up the stories of individual human beings on this earth in the way that I do on my podcast and in this book. So I start with that like, no two stories are alike. and no two people are alike, but we do have a lot in common. We do experience a lot of things in common. And I think that one of the common experiences and common revelations that comes out of these 10 interviews in this book, right, is that even though, as I aforementioned, that this system was forced to admit that it needs us, it was forced to call us essential, right? And as I said, working people don't forget that kind of thing. But I think also as the pandemic wore on, people realized that the system values our labor as essential, but not our lives, right? It would replace us tomorrow if it could, right? It does not see what I try to show in this book. It does not see the blood and sweat and flesh and teeth and memories and feelings and families and histories of the human beings who are keeping this economy running and who kept us from falling into the abyss when COVID-19 hit 2.5 years ago. All of that is considered like, on the margins, outside, inessential, right? The actual stuff that makes us human. And there's a very kind of necessary, like, labor focused message there, because this is what organizing workers are kind of saying all the time, is that we are human beings. We're not just machines, right? This is what Amazon workers say all the time. If you treat human beings like you treat them at Amazon, they break down, right? They sustain injuries that are going to debilitate them for the rest of their lives, whether those be back injuries, knee injuries, so on and so forth, because that's what human beings do when they're treated this way. But for Amazon, it does not see that side of it. It just sees, again, a human-shaped cardboard cutout that can be replaced, but the labor that human-shaped cardboard cutout produces is essential, right? So there's this kind of like, double move here where they admit that they need us, but they also, remind us how little we ourselves as individuals mean to them in this system. And so I think in these interviews, you see people wrestling with that, wrestling with understanding their own sense of self-worth, but also still grappling with this cold monster of a rigged economy that treats us so callously. But that's where I think the point that you made is so important. And I think that that's one of the really, truly hopeful things that emerges from this book. And I hope it's something that, people hear when they listen to my show, Working People, or when they watch the work that I and my colleagues do at the Real News Network, or when they watch the great work that you do at Means TV, all of us working together to try to lift up these struggles and these people and their voices and their lives, right? I hope that what the cumulative effect of that is that we are breaking that sort of the primal ideological hold that capitalism has had on us since you and I were born, right? Because I think I look around me, and so many of the problems that I see in our world today, from runaway climate change to runaway inequality and oligarchy, to reactionary and increasingly fascistic political forces trying to pit us against one another, right? We're in a very tough spot. But when I look around, what I see is the result of a society in which decision-making power has been entrusted to a small few, while the rest of us have either surrendered that power or allowed ourselves to become convinced that we don't want it, we don't need it, and it doesn't belong to us in the first place. It belongs to elected representatives. It belongs to corporate executives in boardrooms. It belongs to editorial boardrooms that are making the decisions on what we should and shouldn't see, or boardrooms in Silicon Valley determining what the algorithms of our social media should be or not. You get the point, right? There's so many ways that the world that we live in is the product of a few, genuinely few ruling class shitheads who have sought their own personal gain and sought to increase their own power at our collective expense. That we are now at a real inflection point where we have to decide: are we going to keep going this way and allow our world to be destroyed by these people, or are we going to remember what I think the labor movement has always been about? The soul of the labor movement is reminding working people that they have the power to change their circumstances, and that power comes from the collective, from working together, from overcoming those divisions within the shop floor and outside of it that the bosses always try to use. And so I think that that's why the labor movement is always such a well of hope for me, because it's not going to solve every problem that we have, but it is an area where regular people learn every single day by working together that actually they do have a lot more power than their boss wants them to believe they do, than politicians want us to believe they do, than right-wing, media pundits tell us that we do, right? The more that people build that power, the more that they want to, get more of it. And so I think that in all of these interviews, you do see in all these little sort of ways, people recognizing that they do have power, right? And that there's something valuable in that and important in that and worth cultivating, whether it is, the power to take care of their loved ones who couldn't venture outside because they were immunocompromised, right? Whether it was the power to stand up to a boss that was not providing workers with the essential safety equipment that they needed to be as safe as they possibly could doing this essential work, right? If they banded together and demanded that, or if they withheld their labor, they realized that they could actually change something. I think that for so long in our lives, up until COVID-19, we were moving through the world as if like it was always made for us and we're just there to experience it, but we ourselves have no real power to do anything to change it. And I think that more people are realizing that we need to change it, because if we keep going down this route, we're going to destroy our shared planet and we're going to destroy our species. But also people are realizing that the changes we need are not just going to be given to us by our bosses, by our politicians, so on and so forth. We have to actually be the ones to drive that change. And people saw how they could do that by pushing harder together over the course of COVID-19 in millions of big and small ways. And I'm genuinely honored that I got a chance to talk to them about it.
And yeah, we've seen it happen. I mean, the teachers and the nurses that you interview in this book, since these interviews, have gone out on strike. And in a lot of ways, teachers and nurses have filled the role that public health agencies should have done in terms of keeping workers safe and students safe, because they're the ones who've had to go on strike to demand PPE, to demand, the Chicago teachers had to go on strike to demand that schools were safe in the middle of COVID. Teachers in Columbus just won, they were on strike last week. They just won concessions on class sizes, making sure that there were enough teachers being hired, making sure that classrooms were safe and had HVAC systems in them, because, a lot of classrooms don't here in the richest country on earth. So you saw, workers taking, they didn't just get class consciousness as a result of this. They're putting it into action through these strikes. And in a lot of areas where the government has failed, unfortunately. Max, you follow in a long line of labor journalists who have made it their focus to talk directly with working people and report on what working people are saying. I mean, thinking of Studs Terkel. Based on your interviews and discussions with working people in America in the year 2020 through 2022, what have you learned about the state of labor and the working class in the United States at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's truly humbling, right? To kind of think of oneself as part of that lineage, right? And in fact, the subtitle for this book is an ode to Studs Terkel and his book Working. And I think one of the most beautiful things about Studs Terkel and his legacy is that there is no one inheritor of it, right? And that, like, as I said, we're kind of all part of that legacy now, right? The work that you and everyone at Means TV does, great labor journalists like Kim Kelly, Michael Sinato, Lauren Gurley, Sarah Jaffe, Michelle Chen, everyone at Labor Notes, right? And in these times, like I could go on for days, and I really wish I could name everyone, but there's so many great people doing this work. And so everyone watching, please support it as best that you can, because we need it more than ever. I think, just to kind of put a bow on it, like something that I have learned from doing this work, right, is just it becomes clear to me every time I talk to another working person about their lives, and every time I'm just struck by the depth and breadth of their life experience and the emotions that they've felt, whether that's about their deceased grandmother, whether that's about a partner, a girlfriend or a boyfriend that they had in high school, that relationship really changed who they were, or an abusive parent when they were a kid, right? These are the kinds of things that I try to talk to people about, to get to know a bit more about who they are and how they came to be the people that they are. And I'm just so struck by the immense difference and like I said, depth of every single person's story. It's like I feel like I have those American Beauty moments, when the dude's talking about the bag in the wind. Like, I have moments like that after every interview that I do, where I'm just like, man, you walk down a single street and you are passing by collectively, like, centuries and centuries worth of experience and knowledge that you just never tap into. We never turn to each other and ask one another about that. We just like largely stay locked in these cages of self that we call our own heads, and we don't actually like try to get out of that and connect with one another on that intimate level. But if we do, I genuinely believe that we will come to have a better appreciation for our fellow workers and fellow human beings, and come to value the sacredness of that experience, and the vastness of the different kinds of experiences that people have. And that makes it all the more powerful when you see those commonalities, when you see commonalities like working people aren't dumb. They're really smart. They're really skilled. They do really essential labor. You could have really deep and interesting conversations about life and death and family and the meaning of life, right? Which I think that's in the book. But again, just living in this sort of capitalist system, one of the things that system has to recommend is it doesn't ask us to think about that. It only asks us to think about ourselves, right? And I think that there's so much that we miss when we're in that mode. But the more that we talk to one another, the more that we learn from each other, the more that we actually take the time to pay attention to what other people do, how they do it, how they live, and who they are. I think that, like, if you're feeling hopeless right now, which it's totally understandable if you do, but if you start talking to other people in that way, if you start giving each other that gift, I think you will remember time and again who and what we're fighting for. And that's really what keeps me going. And it's what keeps me, constantly learning as I do this.
Well said, Max. The book is called The Work of Living. Everyone should go out and get a copy of it. Also, check out the reporting that Max is doing and overseeing over at The Real News, and check out the podcast, Working People. Last thoughts. You've got a minute left here, Max.
No, I think I've talked enough. Just please read these workers' stories, share them. I think a lot of people like to know that this work is being done, but they don't support it, or they don't engage with it as much as they may like to. Please, these workers have shared their stories in open, intimate ways, and they deserve to be heard. They deserve to be shared and listened to. So please, if you can, get the book, share it with folks you think would like it, share the podcast episodes. Just make sure that people hear these stories, because they deserve to be heard.
And you're doing excellent work as a middleman to get those stories out, and we appreciate that, Max. Keep it up.
Thank you, brother. Right back at you.